Hello YouTube, this is Sam Gerrans from Quarternight.com. Today is Friday the 4th of May 2018, and today I want to look at the subject of worshipping a religion, because there's a distinction to be made, isn't there, and between worshipping God and worshipping a religion. And it's not possible to address this subject without making some quite general statements, but I hope that I'm going to be able to make some caveats sufficient to be able to treat this subject as delicately as I can. Now, in my more robust moments, I do generally come out and say that I think that religions pretty much are idols, and I do think that's the case in the majority of cases. Now, that doesn't mean that all people within religions are all bad people. I'm not saying that for a second. But I do think that religions are part of a control mechanism, and they're made to stop people from thinking, and they're a form of herd management. Now, one of the things that most of these cults have got in common, and now I'm talking about traditional religions, is that they turn the faith of the messenger into a faith about a messenger. That's one thing they've all got in common. It doesn't matter whether it's Christianity, whether it's Judaism, whether it's Islam. They'll have this thing in common to a certain extent. Of course, there are intelligent people, sensitive people, thoughtful people who grow up and live their lives, live righteous lives within these traditions. And I'm not saying that that's not the case. And I'm also not saying that all of these religions are without merit. I'm not saying that either. But what I am saying is that in a large amount of cases, when the emphasis is on the religion as opposed to anything else, and the religion is conflated with God, that's where it becomes an idol. A really good example of this, and I recommend anybody look into the Jehovah's Witnesses. If you haven't studied the Jehovah's Witnesses, look up XJW or JW Cult or Jehovah's Witness Cult, something online on YouTube, and just spend a couple of evenings listening to people talk. A really good way to know whether or not you're in a cult or your religion is a cult is to study another one. It's often too hard for people to look at their own religions because they're attached to them, they've got an emotional baggage and all of that. Go and check out another one. Look at Scientology or Mormonism, but I would start with Jehovah's Witness. And one of the reasons is what the Jehovah's Witnesses have done is fundamentally they've conflated God with the with the ruling body, with this organization. And if you're from an Islamic background, in quotes, it'll be very interesting because they've got a whole system of law, a whole system of fiqh, a whole system, almost muftis. They've got over 1,000 different laws, if you're a Jehovah's Witness, that you must obey. And it would be interesting, I'm sure, for many people to spend a few evenings on that. Anyway, now one of the things that, as I'm sort of trying to unpack this worshipping a religion question, one of the things which is undoubtedly the case is that cults have thrived traditionally, historically, on the control of information, and through that information, the control of people. So, for example, if you go into the Crusades, what they told the soldiers going off to fight the infidel, to free Jerusalem from the Saracens, anybody who died there would be, straight to heaven, etc., etc. People would believe this because they didn't have any access. They couldn't read the Bible even. They had no access to any other information. So there was an awful lot of trust put in the priests. Now, in our day and age, over the last 20, 25, 30 years, where we have access now to a much broader range of opinions. People can choose. Now ignorance is a choice. You can not know, but the fact that you don't know is because you don't want to, not because you can't get that access. So it's kryptonite to all cults. It's destroying Jehovah's Witnesses. People are leaving Jehovah's Witnesses in droves once they discover that, well, I mean, what was it, 1914, that Charles Taze Russell said that Jesus was coming back and it was the end of the age. Then it was 1915, then it was 1917, then it was 28, then 1954, and then it was 1975. I mean, they keep, kicking the can down the road. Most Jehovah's Witnesses today don't know about this. They don't know that was the case. But it was, and there are many other reasons why Jehovah's Witnesses are, it's a cult and liars, and that's the correct word. It doesn't mean that all Jehovah's Witnesses are terrible people. There are some very, very good people who are sincere and in the Jehovah's Witness organization. They just don't know about these things. And if you meet one, I recommend not being too aggressive with them. In fact, I recommend to anyone who's in a cult, I'd say, why don't you look at, if you're a Jehovah's Witness, why don't you look at the Mormons and make notes on why you think that they're a cult? It's an easier way of doing it, you see, than sort of having to look at oneself. But the internet is also heavily impacting, whatever we mean by it, Christianity in inverted commas, through the work of people like Bart Ehrman. If you haven't looked into Bart Ehrman, I don't agree with every single thing that Bart Ehrman says, but he's an extremely intelligent man. He's a New Testament scholar, and he will explain the process of the actual textual process of how the New Testament came to be what it is today better than anybody, I think, and in a far more accessible form. And Christians don't know this. There's another chap called Jeff Daugherty who I've just recently come across. Now, he describes himself as the Christian whistleblower. He is an ex-Pentecostal minister. I don't know how long he was a Pentecostal minister, but he's done a very interesting thing. Just for example, he has rearranged the New Testament into its chronological order, which doesn't start with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It starts with James, and you can see, as if you read in that order, you can see that how this narrative developed into what it then became. This sort of the book of John, which was written much later than James, and also that the sort of informational payload, the propaganda payload was Paul. This is all designed around Paul, because what's ostensibly from the apostles is scattered all over the place, but all the writings of Paul are compact together, and the writings ascribed to Paul, because not all of them were written by Paul, and that's just a fact. We know that several of them definitely were, but above and beyond that, probably they weren't. So, but even if, let's assume that they all were written by Paul, those are all together and in chronological order so that they make sense. And the rest of it is sort of designed so that you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are the three synoptic gospels, which are kind of all pretty much the same. Then you go into mad world of John, which is Gnosticism, Greek polytheism, and sun worship, etc. And it's all very. This is what the evangelicals love. They love this book. They really, they stand and fall on John, who's completely different to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I mean, you can read Matthew, Mark, and Luke and not, the sort of whole Son of God thing is not really there. But in John, it definitely is there. There's no question about it, But this was written much, much later. This is the last gospel to be written. And that's then the bridge into Acts. I'm sorry if I'm boring. If you don't have a Christian background, this won't mean an awful lot to you. But the book of Acts is very interesting. I'm just extemporizing on the back of what this chap says. But the book of Acts is a bridge, and the real payload in this bridge is to get you off Jesus and into Paul. because the whole of the New Testament is about Paul. It's a Pauline religion from beginning to end. And so what Paul did, and this is really my point, is he created a religion, or he laid the foundation for a religion about Jesus. What he didn't do was concentrate on what Jesus himself believed. This is the crucial bait and switch, and it's how it always works, pretty much. If you have a red letter Bible, flick through the books of Paul, and you'll see that he almost never quotes Jesus. He isn't interested in the words of Jesus. He's preaching Jesus and him crucified. This is a Jesus of Paul's own contrivance. And this is what happens. The Quran says that God sends after every prophet, shaitans. Anyway, get back to cults. We have Mormons. And if you're a Mormon, I have nothing against you. I've studied Mormonism. Mormonism has, if you've never studied Mormonism and you want something interesting to do for a couple of, for however long you want to spend on it, study Mormonism. Mormonism, if you were born into Mormonism, you would think, and Mormons do think, that there is this, and it's an amazing story about Joseph Smith and the plates of gold and the angel who comes to him, and it would make a great film. It's a superb foundational mythos. But what Mormons don't know is there are 9 different conflicting stories about how Joseph Smith met this angel. Was it one angel and God? Was it 2 angels? Where did it happen? Did it happen once? Did it happen? And once you have that access to that information, the holes become apparent very quickly. Most Mormons don't know. Most Mormons believe that Joseph Smith sat there translating these plates of gold into English, with a quill in hand, with a candle burning. This isn't the case. According to Mormon history, it's not the case. He had a seer stone which he placed in a hat and spoke out of his hat, and it was written down. He was talking out of his hat. Mormons don't know this. Again, if you meet a Mormon, and Mormons are some of the nicest people you're ever going to meet, some of the best people you're ever going to meet are going to be Mormons. They're often superb. I'm just saying it's nothing to do with whether you're a nice person or not. It's that people often, and many Mormons who, when they do come to know about the huge holes in their religion, they stay. Why? Because Mormons have a fantastic family life. They have a great life. It's a good life to be a Mormon. So, however, are we interested in truth or are we not? Scientology, again, I'm not saying being a Scientologist is a good life, but the same kind of control of information goes on, etc. And again, the internet is kryptonite to this. And then we have the biggest cult of them all, which is the cult that we all live in, this cult. And you often get people, there's a particular chap, I can't remember his name, but he left Scientology a number of years ago, and now he's fighting Scientology, but what he's done unwittingly is become a cult member of the Matrix, where anything which disagrees with what the government tells you is a wild conspiracy theory. You can take the man out of the cult. It's quite another matter to take the cult out of the man. All cults have certain characteristics in common. They'll have a set orthodoxy. And this is true for this system. It has a set orthodoxy. I've gone over some of the other cults, the more traditionalist cults, as it were. But this system has an orthodoxy. I'll get into the fact that it changes, but for the present orthodoxy, try critiquing the popular narrative on the Holocaust. See how well things go for you at work after that one, or anything to do with a whole set of questions, and especially to do with sexual identity, sexual politics nowadays, or a number of other subjects are verboten, and cults will have that. also cults will all they'll claim to be the best, and democracy, which let's use that as that's the sort of as the catch-all phrase for what I'm really talking about, so-called democracy. It claims to be free, but it isn't, as anybody who has a birth certificate and pays taxes knows. It can excommunicate you. All cults can excommunicate you, or they have some other hold over you. Excommunication in democracy is, well, I would say street beggars. I think that's why they keep them around. People on the street, the street people, just to keep you in line. I think there's in a film, The Fisher King, there's a communication between the lead guy and a street person, and that's spot on. They keep these people. These are the unwashed. These are the untouchables, and this is what you'll go to. This is what's going to happen to you unless you keep, worshipping on time. Control of information, and mainstream media has one narrative. It's all geared toward a certain thing, and that's this is part of this cult. Objects of worship. In this cult, we have Beyonce and Charles Darwin, depending on where you are in the intellectual scale. But you're going to have to worship. You're going to have to bow down and accept this sort of solar-based belief structure. But also, and importantly, what happens with cults is that they get to change their dogma as and when it suits them. It's please do read 1984 if you haven't read it. There's this old think in 1984, which I've read, I've lost count how many times. Yesterday they were fighting whatever it is, Eurasia, and now we're fighting Oceania, and we've always fought Oceania. How it is today is how it's always been. There's no memory of that it was ever any other way. And this is happening now. Things are going down the memory hole. People have forgotten that people lived without mobile telephones and had actual conversations, and many things besides. Now, all that, I want to get onto the subject of quote-unquote Islam. Because Islam, whatever we mean by that, and I'll get into some of that in a moment, is also being critiqued online by a lot of people with a lot of different agendas. I spent some time forcing myself to listen to some, I have a friend, I don't remember his name, but a rather large American chap who looked to me like an intelligence operative. I could be wrong. Inveighing against Islam. Now, I'm no fan of brand Islam by any means, and he was doing this from the Christian point of view. But he was using some very unsophisticated rhetorical mechanisms to trap his audience. And just in a nutshell, what he did was he basically said that, well, I'm in America, you can't have these conversations in Saudi Arabia, therefore you're in this free place, so you should now shut up and let me speak. Fair enough. But that makes the assumption that all Muslims, whatever we mean by that, have got some huge affinity with Saudi Arabia, which is not true. And then what he did was he basically said that in Christianity you're saved, you have salvation, but Muslims they never know if they're saved. They're sort of cast out into the darkness, and they're only they have to wait until they die, and then God, they have to rely on God. That's like that's a bad thing to weigh their deeds in the balance. Well, yeah, that's right. We know that God is our judge. I mean, even Christians would accept that God ultimately is their judge. There is, it's true that those who hold to the Quran, we don't believe in this sort of, kind of get out of jail free card for no reason, and the idea that somebody else paid for our acts is we don't see it in life. It's a completely, it's an aberration. But he went on to use some tricks, and one of them he said was the only way that Muslims could know that they have salvation. What he means by salvation is, when he's really talking to his Christian audience here, is by dying in jihad. And by jihad, of course, he means some sort of irrational, violent war of some kind. So the implication there was that for any Muslim to have what any Christian already has, he has to go out and basically become some sort of terrorist. It was very tricky. It presupposes an intelligence level, sort of IQ of about 96, and no sort of contact with any facts, pre-existing his presentation, as it were, of them. But he was very clear on what Islam means, and for him, Islam is what the traditionalist says it is. And this is part of the problem with the traditionalist, isn't it? Because when we're having the traditionalist telling us what Islam means, then what you end up with is you giving people like this chap, you're giving him a barrel with fish in it and a loaded double-barrel shotgun. So because he's saying, well, Islam is these 5 things, and everybody, that's it, and off you go. And basically it's, these 5 pillars plus jihad, which is, as it were, quote unquote, sort of open bracket, the Muslims' only option for salvation, close bracket, and away he went. So, he's obviously speaking to his audience. So a lot of Muslims watching that, coming from their traditionalist background, as we were, worshipping their religion, are going to perhaps go along with some of this. Anyway, I've been looking at the question of what is Islam in relation to a broader question, which is to do with law. Because when it comes right down to it, the devil is in the details. And all of these religions that I've just mentioned above, including the matrix system, it's all about law. It's all about some kind of system of law where someone gets to tell you that God, or the will of the people, or whatever it is, says you must live like this. Okay? So I've been looking at, because this is where the real conflict comes in. Now, as I'll get into perhaps a little bit further, the Quran is very sparse on details, as the traditionalist Muslim loves to tell you, because he's right there with all the details for you, see. Anyway, I've been looking at a couple of books, and I'm going to read you a couple of sections from these books. The first is, I don't know if you can see that there, What is Islam? The Importance of Being Islamic by Shahab Ahmed. Now, I will say I haven't read this book. I've skim read it. Because before I read a 600-page book, I want to know if it's really worth reading it. I came to the conclusion, and I may be wrong, that I wasn't going to make the time investment to read this at this time. I may come back to it later. But I'm just going to read you a bit from the conclusion. And this is an intellectual's attempt to describe what Islam is. Quote, conceptualizing Islam as meaning-making for the self in terms of pretext, text, and context of revelation cultivates in us the cognitive and analytical habit of looking for Islam in discursive and praxial diffusion, in the full range of thought and action by which Muslims engage with sources of revelation and with the contextual language of its meanings. It enables us to detect and recognize Islam not just in the usual places where our received cognitive and analytical habits lead us, but where it actually is present in discourse and praxis as means and meanings. Conceptualizing Islam as meaning-making for the self in terms of pretext, text, and context also enables us to recognize that all acts and statements of meaning-making for the self by Muslims and non-Muslims that are carried out in terms of Islam, that is, in terms of any pretext, text, or context, should properly be understood to be Islamic. If you understood what that means, please do write to me. I'll be delighted to know. I'm not an idiot. I couldn't understand what he's talking about. So that's one approach, which is that basically Islam means whatever you want it to mean. Now, another book which I have read from cover to cover, and I definitely recommend, is this one. It's called Heaven on Earth, A Journey Through Sharia Law. As I've mentioned, I'm interested in what we mean by law, and this Sharia is really the core of it. A journey through Sharia law from the deserts of ancient Arabia to the streets of the modern Muslim world, by Sadakat Kadri. And it's published by FSG. Look it up. I'm sure you can find it on Amazon. I have no contact with this guy. Never spoken to him. And I'm not, I don't have affiliate programs or anything like this. I just read what I'm interested in. And this book, I definitely recommend. I'll just read a bit. Conservatives have imagined Islamic law to be as eternal as any other aspect of the faith, and arguments about authenticity have therefore had tremendous legal consequences. That is, to a certain extent, consequent on the very notion of Islam, with its commitment to a revealed text and an inspired prophet, but has affected approaches to historical scholarship as well. The idea has become widespread that God's revelations were built into practical rules by people untainted by impurities, companions of Muhammad, heroic earlier generations and omniscient jurists, whose probity transcends the vagaries of place and the passage of time. It's worth just getting a little bit more of this, because this guy, he's a lawyer. He's a lawyer based in, I think he's English, from England, but he's also practiced law in the States. That claim raises issues similar to those I once encountered in a very different part of the world, the United States. As a law student at Harvard in the late 1980s, I learned that many American conservatives consider the founding fathers of the United States to be possessed of incontestable wisdom. Some went further, arguing that God had manifested his will through their deeds. According to certain lawyers, that could oblige judges to interpret the federal constitution according to its 18th century meaning, or even required that they consider the founders' views when resolving contemporary legal controversies. Limits to the death penalty, for example, or government restrictions on free speech. Back then, I had felt that the deference to ancient vocabularies and dead people's thoughts had the whiff of a séance about it. Pinning down a person's meanings and motives is hard enough when he or she is alive. The collective intention of a large and diverse group of the deceased is difficult to conceptualize, yet alone know. The traditionalist approach toward interpreting the Sharia does not on its face look very different. It seems more akin to ancestor worship than any grave venerating ritual could be, simply because, notwithstanding my personal debt to Abdullah of Mecca, holy wisdom does not automatically pass down through the generations. This is a travel book, very written with a very light touch. It's extremely readable. And it's not all as terse and compact as the bit that I've just read. But if you want a sort of whistle-stop tour of Brand Islam, read this book. It's written with a soupçon of humour as well. It's not he's not gunning for anybody. It's very, very intelligently written, and you won't regret reading it, I'm sure. Anyway, to continue. So he's trying to, I think, in some ways to answer the question, what is Islam? And he goes about it in a way which includes cultural aspects, historical aspects, legal aspects. I mean, the guy's a lawyer, and so on and so forth. Then, of course, we have the traditionalists' definition of what he means by Islam, and it's all very simple. Obviously the definition comes from hadith, it doesn't come from the Quran, but it is, and it is the 5 pillars and plus one, the jihad thing. If we're talking about Sunni Islam, if that would be his answer. So it turns out that Islam can mean pretty much whatever you want it to mean if you're an intellectual, and only what you want it to mean if you're not. And this is why, in my opinion, Islam, brand Islam, is a natural bedfellow with democracy, because democracy can mean whatever you want it to mean. If you and the meaning of democracy changes depending on who we want to bomb, who's central, where we want to install, not we, but where they want to install a central bank, and the United Nations education system and all the rest of it. That place will need democracy, and it's a form of imposing one world hegemony, and that's what it's doing. Likewise, Christianity today can almost mean anything as well. I mean, this isn't the preserve of Islam. It's not like Islam is this unique and special thing. Any religion to some extent, but when we're talking about these broad umbrellas, can mean kind of anything you want. I mean, what do you mean by Christianity? Are you talking about Jesuit inquisitions, or are you talking about the Quakers? It's such a broad. It's not just a broad church. I mean, these are worlds apart. So, in short, religions are brands, and and I mean, even within the sort of subset of Bible-believing Christians. I mean, Bible-believing Christians, every Christian will tell you that they're a Bible-believing Christian, as though it's clear what a Bible-believing Christian is. Some years ago in Spain, we had all of our money stolen from us at that time by a Bible-believing Christian. I mean, he's what are we talking about when we say Bible-believing Christian? The Bible, it's not even one book. It's 66 books. I mean, the Jews who had what the Christians call the Old Testament, if you read, and I have a collection of, hold on. I have these art scroll sections of the Tanakh by, this one's Ramban, the Talmudic scholar understanding of the Old Testament. I don't believe it. But it's fascinating to compare that with what Bible-believing Christians believe it means. So it's a brand, isn't it? Anyway, I am going to get to my point in a minute, my summary. So the traditionalist Muslim has his brand, and he calls that brand Islam, but I call it brand Islam. Now I'm going to sort of wrap this up by reading my answer, or part of my answer, to someone who wrote to me, who's had a belly full of feuding cults. In this case, I think it was Hindus and Muslims, among whom she lives. And in answer to her letter to me, I said to her, because she was really asking me to sort of unpack this, and I said, I don't have a 2-word answer for you, but what you say at the end of your email speaks volumes to me. Quote, to my Muslim friends, I'm a crazy heretic. To my atheist friends, I'm a delusional Muslim. To my friends from other religions, I'm an apologist trying to give Islam a better image. To the girl in the mirror, I'm just a confused person trying to make sense of the world around me. End quote. And then I'll continue with my answer. This was, for me, although with different specifics, the same before I started out on what's become my journey, this journey where I just cut loose any pre-existing allegiance to anything which didn't make sense to me. That was fundamentally what I've done. My entire purpose was to do my own due diligence on the Quran. I wanted the truth, no matter what the price or what the answer. If the Quran is from God and complete and preserved as it claims, then let's find out, because if it is, then why follow anything else? And if it's not from God, then why follow it at all? I wanted truth first, no matter what, and to apply my full intelligence to this question without the confusions of having to climb over a religion. And my book, The Quran, A Complete Revelation, which as ever you may download for free from Quranite.com, is the output of that process of due diligence. To draw closer to your question, the traditionalist would answer in the affirmative. Anyone who rejects the religion of Islam, read Brand Islam, is an unbeliever. However, he's in direct opposition here with the Quran, since that tells us that Ibrāhīm was neither a Christian nor a Jew, yet he was not of the idolaters. The following question here is obvious. Was he a traditionalist Muslim? Obviously, he cannot have been. And if you do sometimes find some somewhat mentally challenged people who will try to say that he was, but in that case, all you need to say is, well, which madhab did he belong to? Which school did he belong to of Islam? There's no sensible answer to that one, of course. And if we read in the Quran, it says, God says to him, submit. And he says, I have submitted to the Lord of the worlds. There was no religion involved, you see. To continue, Ibrāhīm rejected all the cults of his day. He was satisfied with nothing less than God. Now, I cannot speak to what is contained in the heart of another man. It's not my place to judge, but from what I see, the evidence points to the fact that there are many people who claim to worship God when in fact they worship the religions. That is, they make an idol of their religion. That's not to say that everyone who follows the various forms of Christianity or Islam is a bad person or an idolater. Not at all. But it's like a workshop. Claiming to live in a carpenter's workshop doesn't make you a carpenter. What makes you a carpenter is that you make things out of wood. What makes you a good carpenter is that you make good things out of wood. The workshop in and of itself means little or nothing. I'm not sure what just going out and attacking those who do not accept the primacy of your workshop makes someone, but whatever the answer, carpenter is nowhere in that answer. For many people, their religion is a cult, which is a distortion of the workshop they happen to have been born into. Meanwhile, there are people who reject all such things as idols and yet worship God, to quote the New Testament, in spirit and in truth. God knows the truth of it, and on the day of judgment we will see before us all that for which we truly strived, no matter what we said or claimed. What I've learnt is, don't wait for others to catch up. We are born alone, we die alone. We don't need a religion to choose God. At least Ibrāhīm, he didn't need it. God's part of our contract with him, i.e. Al-Fatiha, is found at 1:6-7, and our part is at 1:5. This is the path. God is good, he is merciful, and abounding in grace no matter the hardships, and there will be many. And he inclines to those who incline to him, and are satisfied with him alone as their portion. Now that's what I answered, and I stand by that. I'm not claiming that all religions are necessarily evil and bad. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying look at what you make in your workshop, because that the product doesn't lie. That's all for now. If you're listening on YouTube, you can download my full translation of the Quran free using the button in the top right hand corner, or buy the hard copy there at 10% less than on Amazon. I also encourage you to sign up for the Quranite Plus newsletter on the site to get occasional micro updates. You can download the audio from my YouTube videos to your mobile device using the links in the drop down below. I recommend meetquranites.com to connect with other Quran alone believers. Like if you like, comment if you have something constructive to say, and subscribe to get more each week. And use the link in the drop down below to donate if you would like to help me keep doing this. And remember, this life is short, eternity is long. If you want good trees, plant good seeds.